And just as a reminder, before I start on the lecture, your research proposal is due by 11:59 p.m. on Thursday. Just what you're writing the paper on, not the actual paper. So only need about a paragraph from you guys. So don't panic thinking you have to write a 5-page paper due date. No, just what you're going to write the paper on. Okay. We're going to wrap up our discussion on civil rights today. We talked last class about the civil rights movement, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the movement for African Americans to get closer to equality here in the U.S. So today we're going to talk about other groups that have faced issues with civil rights, a little bit on affirmative action, and we'll end with a discussion about the Black Lives Matter movement and the current civil rights issues we're facing. Okay. So we're going to start off by discussing issues of gender discrimination. At the beginning of this country, women fell into a practice known as coverture. Once they got married, legally, they no longer had a separate identity from their husbands. They are basically considered to be part of their husband. So they couldn't own property, couldn't keep any wages that they earned, and they weren't allowed to sign contracts. So legally, once a woman got married, she no longer had her own identity. She was no longer considered an individual, but part of her husband. And at the end of the 1800s, well, in the middle of the 1800s, the Supreme Court was called upon to hear a case about a woman who wanted to be a doctor in Illinois, and they upheld the laws giving certain professions to men only, like doctor or lawyer. That didn't really change until the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, where women were allowed to become doctors and lawyers. Also, legally, for the most part, women were not, their names were not on the mortgage, even if they were co-paying the mortgage with their husbands. So husbands could sell the house without their wife's permission because she wasn't on the mortgage. Even if she was helping to pay it, she had no right over their property. And up until 1974, women could not apply for a credit card in their own name. It had to be through their husband or their father. They couldn't open a bank account in some states without the name of their father or their husband, and they weren't on the mortgage. But the more shocking fact is that marital rape wasn't fully a crime until 1993. North Carolina was the last state to outlaw marital rape. The thinking was that it can't be rape if it's your husband. So it took until 1993 for it to become a crime to rape your spouse. And in case that wasn't depressing enough, statistics show that 1 in 5 women in the United States will be raped in their lifetimes. versus 1 in 71 men. 2 out of 3 sexual assaults go unreported. Women do not, or men, do not file a sexual assault report. If it is reported, only 18% of complaints lead to an arrest, and within that 18%, only 2% of cases actually result in a conviction. So for the most part, for survivors of sexual assault, they don't think it's worth the time and the frustration to file a formal complaint. Only 22% of sexual assault survivors actually fight their attacker. The majority, 56%, try to plead or reason with them. Partly because they're afraid that if they try to fight back, they might get beaten up or even killed, especially if their attacker has a weapon. Okay, so after the civil rights movement, there was a women's rights movement that started in the mid to late 1960s. Women who'd taken part in the civil rights movement decided they wanted to push for rights of their own. So they made it illegal to basically post jobs for men versus women. So what they used to do, what employers used to do, is in the classified ads of the newspapers, they put jobs for women in one column and jobs for men in the other. And the jobs for women, more often than not, would be teacher, secretary, lower paying jobs. So they managed to get that outlawed, as well as getting the right to have a bank account, mortgage, or credit card in their own name. There's also an attempt to pass an Equal Rights Amendment. What this would have done is outlawed discrimination on the basis of sex. Now, supporters of this amendment, including Gloria Steinem, said it's necessary to end discrimination against women and to try to equalize gender roles. But the opponents, led by Phyllis Schlafly, said it's too radical, it's too much change too quickly, and they argued that it would lead to unisex bathrooms and women being required to register for the draft. Ironically enough, because women are now allowed to serve in combat, there is a court case looking at whether or not women should be required to sign up for the draft as well. So even without the Equal Rights Amendment, women may end up being asked to register for the draft at 18. So the Equal Rights Amendment failed. And part of the argument successfully made against it is that the 14th Amendment protects us from discrimination, right? Equal protection under the law. There were some laws created to try and fix issues of gender discrimination. Title IX has 2 key components to it. The first part is that it mandated the creation of women's sports teams. Women's soccer, volleyball, swimming, etc. Because if you're going to offer men's sports teams, you need to give women the chance to get scholarships and play college athletics. The other key part to Title IX is that it requires colleges and universities to report sexual assault on college campuses. Now, colleges don't want to be seen as a rape college, so they tend to underreport sexual assault or discourage a complaint from being filed. There's a really good documentary on this called The Hunting Ground that talks about how schools unfortunately tend to underreport sexual assault, especially if it involves a student athlete. But under the law, colleges are supposed to report instances of sexual assault and rape on campus. And the Obama administration was pushing for there to be more responsibility, more response from the colleges on this issue. There's also Title X. Title X provides subsidies for sexual health care, birth control, STD testing, pap smears, mammograms, and so on. So registrations of clinics offering sexual health care services. The Trump administration was threatening to cut off Title X funding to Planned Parenthood, but Title X funding doesn't go for abortion anyway. It goes for the other parts of what Planned Parenthood does. No federal funds are allowed to be used to pay for abortion. So Title X just takes care of things like contraception, STD testing, general sexual wellness. And it applies for men too. You can go to a clinic and get tested as well. Women and men have had to deal with issues around sexual harassment. If you've watched a show like Mad Men that's set in the 1960s, it used to be fairly common for women to experience sexual harassment in the workplace, and basically they were told to ignore it or to laugh at it, not to raise any fuss about it. Today, sexual harassment can take two forms. The first is what they call the quid pro quo. Essentially, someone saying to you, you have sex with me and I'll give you a promotion. Blatant, obvious sexual harassment. That's not as common as it used to be. What we see now nowadays is what they call a hostile work environment, where they make inappropriate comments, inappropriate touching, jokes that make someone feel uncomfortable in the workplace. If you experience that, you can file a complaint because it can take the form of sexual harassment. So they are trying to tackle that as well. And in terms of employment equality, statistically speaking, women make about 78 cents for every dollar that a man makes. Part of that is tied to the type of work. If you work as a teacher, admin assistant, daycare, you're not going to make as much money compared to someone who works in finance or real estate. Now, the Supreme Court had originally said that you only have 180 days to file a complaint after you get hired if you think your company isn't paying you fairly. Most people within the first 180 days of a new job aren't walking around going, hey, how much do you make, right? So during the Obama administration, the Lilly Ledbetter Act was passed, allowing for an employee to sue a company at any time if they find out that they're not being paid the same as someone at the same level. So if you have two managers, one male, one female, and you're paying the woman significantly less, she can file a complaint about that. But the other part of the problem with the pay gap is the reality that women suffer from what they call the mommy trap. If you step out of work to have a child, it does take longer to get a promotion. In academia, it takes, on average, 3 to 5 years to get tenure, basically a secured position. If you have a child while you're on the tenure track, it's going to take another year or two. So part of it is the fact that if women have children, it's harder for them to come back and get promoted, so they do tend to make a little less money over their lifetime. And of course, we have very, very little maternity or paternity leave in the United States. Most women are lucky to get 6 weeks. Globally, there are countries where they could get up to a year. For men, too. Countries like Sweden, it could be divided, like the father could stay home for a while and then the mother. It's not guaranteed here. heard a story about a woman who went back to work 2 days after giving birth because she had no maternity leave under her employment status. Okay. Now we're going to talk about gender discrimination, or sorry, not gender discrimination, civil rights issues for various ethnicities in the United States. In terms of Latinos and Hispanics, Mexican Americans, of course, used to be barred from voting. They were placed into segregated housing, schools, etc., alongside African Americans. So they faced issues with discrimination as well. We also have to deal with the reality of how migrant farm workers are treated. Now, conditions have gotten slightly better, but in the 60s, it was pretty obvious that the farm workers were not being paid a fair wage. The housing was extremely poor, lack of sanitary conditions. So there were protests led by people like Cesar Chavez, boycotts, hunger strikes. So it's gotten better, but it's still not great. There's still issues with fair compensation, housing, workplace safety, and so on. And part of it is the nature of the work and it being seasonal. So if you get a seasonal visa from Mexico, you're just not going to have as much luck in pushing back on unsafe conditions. In terms of undocumented or illegal immigrants, the Supreme Court has said that the children of undocumented immigrants are entitled to an education. Also the children of farm workers. So if they move around, the school still has to accept the children and give them an education. Also, the Supreme Court has said that illegal immigrants are entitled to emergency medical care. A hospital cannot refuse to treat someone because they are an undocumented immigrant. So if an undocumented immigrant is working in a factory and there's an accident, by law, the local hospital has to treat them because they are entitled to at least the minimum of emergency medical care. We're still dealing, of course, with DACA and the Dreamers, the children who are brought here illegally. Some discussion about a path to citizenship. For some of the Dreamers, one of the quickest ways to solve the problem is to join the military. So we do see Dreamers joining the military to try and get a path to citizenship that way. But we've also seen issues with the treatment of citizens who are here legally or legal migrants. For a while, there was a program that required state and local law enforcement to run someone's fingerprints through a database. If you come into the United States legally, you are fingerprinted as part of the background process. So your fingerprints would show up in a Homeland Security database. So if they fingerprinted someone and their prints weren't on file, they were required to report it to ICE and possibly deport this person. That program's been abolished. So we do see issues with people being arrested or detained even though they're citizens. There's a case in California where a man was driving his pregnant wife who was in labor to the hospital. They stopped at a gas station and he was arrested on suspicion of being an illegal immigrant. She ended up having to drive herself to the hospital, and it turned out the man was there legally. But you can't undo the damage of arresting someone and then it turning out to be false. There was also a case in, I believe it was New York, where an undocumented immigrant working for a pizza place was delivering pizzas to a military base and ICE arrested him. And a judge tossed out the arrest saying he wasn't doing anything illegal at the time, you had no grounds to arrest him. He wasn't breaking the law, you just decided to detain him. And then, of course, there's issues with border security, the border wall. There's no such thing as a completely sealed border. People will find a way around it. You build a taller fence, they'll go over, they'll go under, they'll find a way around it. Plus, sections of the fence have been falling down in high winds, so that's not exactly a good sign, right? People are going to find a way in no matter what. So you can build a taller fence, but if people are going to find a way in no matter what, there's no way to completely secure a border. It's just not possible. Also, international law says that requesting asylum cannot be a crime. So if someone reports to the U.S. border and says, I am seeking asylum, you can take them to a processing center, but you cannot take them back across the border until they've had a hearing of some kind. So you can't arrest someone for requesting asylum, and you can't just take them back out of the country without a process, without a hearing to determine if they have a viable fear of going back, if they might possibly be killed if they're sent back to their home country. Okay, in terms of Asian Americans, there was discrimination against Asian Americans up until about the 1940s, 1950s. And it was in the U.S. v. Wong Kim art case that the Supreme Court said anyone born in the United States is entitled to full citizenship. The case involved the son of Chinese immigrants who had been born in the U.S. When the country decided to kick his parents out, tried to kick him out too, saying he wasn't a citizen. And this is when the Supreme Court stepped in and said, yes, he is. If you are born in the United States, you are a citizen automatically. Not the case in every country, but here it is. So they couldn't send him back to China because he was here illegally. And the Chinese Exclusion Act didn't allow Chinese immigrants or Japanese immigrants into the United States. Now, the Chinese Exclusion Act was eventually repealed in 1943 because China was on the side of the U.S. in World War II. But for a long time, Asian immigrants were not allowed to come to the United States. And then, during World War II, one of the worst civil rights violations in modern history occurred. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt ordered people of Japanese descent, including American citizens, to be forcibly relocated to camps in California, Utah, Arizona, and other states. 120,000 people of Japanese descent were illegally interned, including 90,000 American citizens. The camps were terrible. There was overcrowding, poor sanitary conditions, and people lost everything: their homes, their jobs, their businesses. And unfortunately, in what, in my opinion, has to be one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in history, in the Korematsu case, the Supreme Court upheld the illegal detention of citizens, saying it was a military necessity. So not only did the federal government violate civil liberties, but the Supreme Court allowed them to do so. So historically, this is considered one of the worst cases ever. Now, eventually, of course, the internment ended, and in the 1980s, early 1990s, the federal government did formally apologize and offered reparations. And the Supreme Court has said that was a bad decision, although of course it hasn't been overturned because they haven't had a case similar to that. Yeah. Okay. And then eventually in the Lau case, the Supreme Court said you have to educate students even if they're not completely fluent in English. You can put them into English as a second language class. You can offer bilingual education, but you still have to educate them. One way or another, they are entitled to an education. So you've got to find a way to work with their limited English. You can put them in English tutoring, again, put them in an English as a second language classroom, but they are entitled to an education. So school districts have to find a way to work with students who are not fluent in English. And we use the term internment camp, but essentially the Japanese were put into American concentration camps. All right, and now we get to a group that, to be quite blunt, has been monumentally screwed in their entire history. Native Americans. Okay, they were here first, but they weren't granted citizenship until after 1924. Yeah, you gotta appreciate the irony of that a little bit. It's ridiculous. But it took until 1924 when Congress said every person in the U.S. is a citizen for Native Americans to actually be considered citizens. And of course, over time, their land was illegally seized by the government, sometimes through very dubious treaties, and sometimes through the blatant stealing of land like the Trail of Tears, where various tribes were forced off their lands in states like Oklahoma, and forced into reservations where thousands of them died. So there has been some attempt to get the land back, not very successfully. There's been some compensation, but getting the land back just isn't something they're really going to be able to do. So what they've done is they've offered sovereignty for the tribes instead. So if a tribe has sovereignty, for example, the Seminole Nation in Florida, once you step onto tribal land, you are subject to the laws of the tribe, not the U.S. government. So if you commit a crime on sovereign territory, you're going to deal with the laws of that tribe. So for example, if there's a murder on a reservation, state, local, and federal law enforcement have to get permission from the tribe to come onto the land. They do not have jurisdiction there. So if you go onto sovereign territory, make sure you're obeying the laws there. And unfortunately, Native Americans, up until about even the 1950s, 1960s, the children were being taken away and sent to boarding schools where they couldn't speak their language, couldn't practice their culture, and were more often than not forced to convert to Christianity. So a lot of the language and the culture was lost over time. The Native Americans have fought for the right to teach their own language in their schools, to preserve the culture and language, because so many languages have been lost. So they do have the right to teach the children in their own language, to preserve the languages as much as they can. And it was the Navajo language that was used to code the messages for the Allies in World War II. The Navajos are Native Americans, were very successful in the war effort. So there's a need to preserve these languages. There's also, as a way of compensation, legalized gambling on some reservations, hotels, casinos, things like that. They can't make a lot of money for the tribes, but life on the reservations is very, very tough. High rates of alcoholism, high unemployment, drug use. The crime rates on reservations are 2.5 times higher than the national average, and it's even worse to be a Native American woman. 1 in 3 Native American women are sexually assaulted in their lifetime, and 84% of Native American women experience some type of violence in their lifetime, mostly domestic violence. They also have a tendency to disappear or get murdered at higher rates compared to the average population. And unfortunately, for a long time, law enforcement just wasn't paying that much attention to it. It was largely ignored. And in Canada, the problem got so bad that there was a stretch of Highway 16 called the Canadian Highway of Tears, where over 40 Indigenous women were murdered or went missing. And it took the Canadian government a couple of decades to realize there was a potential serial killer along this stretch of highway and actually connect the dots. So unfortunately, they do tend to face a large number of problems. And unfortunately, if a Native American woman goes missing or is murdered, it's a lot harder to solve the case. And there's just not as much attention paid to when they do go missing. Any questions so far? Any questions online? All right. So in terms of some of the other groups, disabled Americans are protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA requires equal employment rights and access to public businesses for the disabled. So this is why there's handicapped parking, wheelchair ramps, elevators in buildings with more than one floor for the most part, handicapped accessible housing, things like tubs that people who need a wheelchair can get in and out of more easily. It's also illegal to discriminate against the disabled in employment, housing, and healthcare. Unfortunately, they do still face a fair number of challenges. Not every building is accessible. Some older buildings, unfortunately, there's no way to get in there. We've also seen problems with, in airports, there was one case where, for whatever reason, the wheelchair ramp to get on a plane didn't work, so a disabled pilot was required to crawl on board the plane. And another case where a woman with, I believe it was Parkinson's, was essentially tied to her wheelchair by airport personnel who couldn't stop moving. Obviously, that's a problem, right? We don't want to see that happening. So there are still issues with accommodating individuals with disabilities. Still some work that needs to be done on that. In terms of sexual orientation, it used to be a crime to be gay. You could be fired from your job for being gay, and you could not work for the federal government if you were LGBT. Also, we didn't used to be able to serve in the military. In 1993, Congress passed what they thought was a fair compromise with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, where they said gays and lesbians can serve in the military under two conditions. One, you can't be publicly out, and two, no same-sex relationships while you're in the military. What could possibly go wrong with that? Obviously, there were issues with people being involuntarily outed. And so eventually in 2011, President Obama said, enough. And now gays and bisexuals are allowed to serve in the military. Currently, transgender individuals are not. President Trump said no to that. We'll have to see what happens going forward. But there are more protections for the LGBT community. There's same-sex marriage, of course, and the Supreme Court earlier this year said sexual orientation is a protected class in the Civil Rights Act. So it is no longer legal to fire someone for being gay or refuse to hire them for being gay. So those protections now exist on the federal level. We've also seen the introduction of hate crimes legislation. On the federal level, in 2009, President Obama signed into law the Shepard-Byrd Act, named for two men who've been the victims of horrifically violent hate crimes. Matthew Shepard was a young man in Laramie, Wyoming, who was gay, went out one night, met up with some guys who then beat him and left him tied to a fence. He laid from his injuries, and the first person who saw him fight was a scarecrow while the blood never hit. And then the second part of the act is named for James Byrd, B-Y-R-D. Jr. He was a black man walking down a road in Jasper, Texas in 1998. Three white supremacists stopped and offered him a ride. They then chained him to the back of the truck and dragged him to his death. He eventually died when he hit a culvert and he was decapitated. And they found parts of his body all over the road. One of the worst hate crimes in modern history. So if someone commits a crime because of a person's religion, ethnicity, race, or sexual orientation, they can add a hate crimes charge and up the penalty. So if you murder someone because they're gay, it can be a harsher sentence. If you beat up someone because they're Muslim, it can be a longer sentence. So prosecutors can add a hate crimes charge, although of course sometimes it is hard to prove it was a hate crime. You have to be able to prove pretty definitively that this person was murdered or attacked because of some protected class. And an interesting little fact about Matthew Shepard. He was cremated, but his parents were afraid to put up a headstone because they were afraid people would desecrate it. So his ashes are actually interned in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. because they'll be safe there. People won't try to vandalize the grave or anything. Okay, so we did touch on affirmative action a little bit last class. Affirmative action is basically a policy that takes into consideration race, gender, ethnicity, to provide opportunities for groups that were discriminated against, to make up for the fact that women and minorities weren't allowed into certain fields or certain jobs. So it's why on a college admissions form, you can be asked for your gender, your race, and your ethnicity, and same with a job application. Now, there are some restrictions on affirmative action. Schools aren't allowed to use a quota system. So if Harvard can't say 10% of the incoming freshman class must be African American. They're also not allowed to use a separate admission system. Schools would basically put minority candidates into a separate system where they'd be given like 5 extra points or something on their application. You can't do that. So you can't say we have to have a certain percentage, and it can't be a separate system. You can use race, gender, and ethnicity as a factor, but it can't be a completely separate set of guidelines. And so the federal government is required to prove that affirmative action serves an important interest. By and large, they have been able to do so. There have been challenges to affirmative action, especially in college admissions. In the Grutter case, Barbara Grutter was a white applicant for the University of Michigan Law School, who said that her test scores were equal to or better than minority applicants, so she should have been allowed into the school. And the Supreme Court said, sorry, race can be used to support diversity. You don't want a law school being entirely white, so race can be a factor in admissions. And then more recently, in the Fisher case, Abigail Fisher was denied admissions to the University of Texas and claimed that she was denied admissions because she was white, so she sued. And the University of Texas was able to prove that it wasn't because of race, it was because her test scores were lower than the average applicant, as were her grades. They were able to successfully say she just didn't meet the academic standards. So the Supreme Court has upheld the right to use race as a factor of admissions, saying it serves a compelling state interest to ensure equality in education. And she wasn't the right person to test this case because she didn't have good enough grades or test scores. So she couldn't prove that she'd been discriminated because of race. So she wasn't the right test person to take on affirmative action. And she got into other schools anyway. She got into LSU, so it's not like she didn't get into any other school, she just didn't get into the University of Texas. Now keep in mind, even though they are allowed to ask you about some things like that, you can decline to answer. If you're not comfortable, you can say, decline to answer. It's a way of helping schools and companies understand how many minority applicants are we getting, how many men versus women. Are we doing enough to make sure we have a diverse workforce, things like that. Okay, so in terms of civil rights today, when surveyed, 74% of blacks and 44% of whites see racism against blacks as a widespread problem. That percentage for whites is going up because of things like Black Lives Matter, instances of police violence. So we are seeing that number changing a bit for white Americans. And there tends to be two different views on the issues around civil rights and affirmative action. The more conservative viewpoint is that traditional American rights are individual rights. So they argue that civil rights laws and affirmative action focus on group rights, not individual rights. They also argue that the Constitution is colorblind, and so any discrimination provided by the federal government is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. Liberals will come back and say it's not colorblind if it allows for slavery. They also argue that the essence of discrimination is that you're discriminating against an entire group. African Americans as a whole were not allowed to vote in most places, or live in certain neighborhoods, or stay in certain hotels. So they argue that you have to attack discrimination on a group level, that you can't wait for every single individual who's been discriminated against to file a complaint. And they say that you gotta take into consideration that you have to make up for past discrimination. You have to give minorities and women a better shot at the fields they didn't used to be allowed into. And there's also the argument that affirmative action isn't necessarily just for race or gender. But there are things like benign quotas to help promote diversity. So for example, veterans get hiring preferences for government jobs. So they get preference in border patrol or homeland security or working for Congress. And you see a lot of companies talking about their practice of hiring veterans. Starbucks touting their program for veterans. And most people are okay with that. They look at that and they say, yeah, you know, it's hard to transition back to civilian life. We should help veterans get a job. So they don't have a problem with the idea of veterans getting a little extra boost in terms of employment. And there's also the argument that there's always been preferential treatment in private colleges. If your family is wealthy, your entire family went to a school, or your parent teaches at a school, you're probably going to get in, even if your grades aren't that great, right? If your parents can donate $200,000 to the University of Notre Dame, you're probably getting in. If your mom teaches philosophy at Harvard, you're probably getting in. If 3 generations of your family went to Yale, you're probably getting in, right? So there's always been an unfair advantage in some ways. It's never been a level playing field in certain areas. There's always advantages that can come about simply because of who you are. We look at the whole celebrity college admission scandal, right, where they basically bought their kids' way into college. I mean, obviously outright bribery is going to be a problem, but if it's a question of their grades are borderline, but their parents donate on a regular basis, kids probably getting in anyway. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing to take into consideration the family ties to a college, but we do have to acknowledge that they exist. We do have to acknowledge that it's It's never been a completely level playing field to begin with. Okay, any questions? Anything unclear? No? Okay. So, I just want to talk a bit about civil rights issues. Obviously, there's been a history of issues with discrimination, violence, and unequal treatment, especially to minorities. And a pretty famous example of this is Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy who was walking home from a store, and a white woman accused him of whistling at her. So he was then surrounded and beaten to death. And it later turned out that the woman had lied about the fact that he whistled at her. But even if he had, that's not a crime, right? So when he died, there was a lot of outrage about it. And his mom decided to have no casket so everyone could see what happened to her son. I'm going to show you a photo. Fair warning, it's a little graphic, but you'll have to kind of understand what we're talking about here. Emmett Till when he was alive, Emmett Till in his coffin. Yeah, it's a lot to take in, but his mom wanted an open casket because she wanted people to see what had happened, what was going on, what had happened to a 14-year-old boy. Okay. Obviously, in some ways things have gotten better, right? You don't see people being beaten up necessarily for interracial dating. Lynching, very rare these days, but there are still issues we have to deal with in terms of civil rights. Um, so what do you guys think about things like Black Lives Matter? What do you think about some of the protests and discussions that are going on? Oh, the one in Wisconsin. Yeah. Oh, did the kid who shot a couple of people? Yeah, I haven't seen anything recently. I mean, he's been arrested, I think, what they're charging him with now. It could, yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe. Maybe. Yeah. Yeah, that one definitely, yeah. Because that was in response to a shooting that had happened not that long ago. So yeah, that was interesting. But yeah, I haven't heard anything very recently about that kid. Yeah, you can call him a kid. He was, well, no, he was what, 17? 17, yeah, and brought a gun across state lines illegally, and yeah. Yeah, yeah. His parents could have owned it. He could have gotten it from a friend of a friend, or I mean, there's, yeah. But the fact that he wasn't even stopped by the cops when it's on carrying it says something interesting. Yeah. And that's part of what the protesters are talking about, right? Like, okay, if you have an active shooter and you don't have to kill someone like Dylan Roof or that kid, then why are you kneeling on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes? Like, why is it that you can manage to talk an active shooter down, but if it's someone who's unarmed, they die, right? Why are you kneeling for 8 minutes on someone's neck? That's a damn long time. Yeah. And the majority of the protests are peaceful. A study found that like 97% of the protests are peaceful, but we do tend to pay attention to one thing in the news, right? When they burn down like the Wendy's and things like that, that's where we tend to pay more attention. And so let me ask you guys this. Do you trust local law enforcement? Do you feel like if you got pulled over, it would be fine? It wouldn't be a big deal? No? Okay. Really? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, I was asked in my last class, and I was like, honestly, for me, I don't necessarily worry about what would happen if the cops pull me over. I'm more worried about whether or not I should call the cops. Because I don't want to be that Karen, right? That white woman who's calling cops and everyone like, right? But at the same time, it's like if it's something very serious, on the one hand, you should be able to call the cops. On the other hand, I do find myself wanting to hesitate a little bit, like, for what, what if this escalates? What if it gets out of hand? It worries me a little bit. It makes me a little hesitant in that sense to want to call the cops. And part of the problem, I think, is that we put too much pressure on the cops. They're supposed to be law enforcement, conflict resolutionists, mental health therapy, right? They're supposed to do everything. And that's not fair. I think there should be mental health counselors attached to law enforcement who can be sent out to deal with a case of someone who maybe isn't taking their medication or is having a mental health break. Officers who are trained in mediation help de-escalate a situation. But less pressure on law enforcement to be the go-to source for every problem all of the time. That's just not fair. There's too much pressure on law enforcement. I think we need to refigure out what we expect out of law enforcement and maybe take some of that burden off of them a little bit.
I think a lot of engagement already exists. Like we have seen a lot of engagement in the military.
Yeah.
Like if somebody goes to the military and you see somebody, you do something. As a trial, you would. Everybody has thought so, like it's all what happened down to you.
Sure.
And it doesn't matter whether it's terrorist or not. And I just think that the cops have that same system in place. They wouldn't have no problem.
Yeah, that's a good point. Also, I think if there wasn't a code of silence, right? You're a rat if you talk about something you saw a fellow officer did. But if you saw a fellow officer breaking the law, shouldn't you report that? I mean, I think we need to get rid of the culture of it's a thin blue line and don't you dare cross it, right? Don't you dare report corruption or if somebody breaks the law, right? Break that code that says you're a tattler or a rat or whatever if you actually report someone for breaking the law. Yeah, that might help too. Yeah, I mean it's a complicated situation all around. Cops are asked to basically rely on their instincts and their training in a situation, and sometimes things just get out of hand. Um, But then you get cases like in New York in the late 90s where an immigrant from, I think it was from Sierra Leone, was in the doorway of his apartment and he reached for his wallet and got shot like 96 times by the cops. Yeah, I mean that's just not, that should not have happened. But you also want to make sure law enforcement is effective, right? You don't want them getting shot because they hesitate too long So, I don't know. It's complicated, but I think it's important that we're having at least some discussion on it, that there's some talk about it. And it is important to keep in mind that the Civil Rights Act and Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were only 55, 56 years old. So not that long that we've started to see a push for greater equality. We've made progress, it's just very slow in some ways, but I think it's important to have the discussion at least. Open the line of conversation a little bit. Any other thoughts, comments? Have any of you heard about Emmett Till before today? Like the death of Emmett Till? I think so. Yeah. There's also a sign that they keep putting up to honor him, and people keep shooting the sign, so they're trying to figure out how to make it so people can't shoot the sign. Yeah. And nothing happened to the woman, by the way, when she came out and said, "Oh, I lied, nothing ever happened to her." Like, oh well. Yeah. Okay. Thursday we will talk about most of Chapter 6. We're not going to cover all of Chapter 6 and all of Chapter 7 because there's some repetitive information in the two chapters. So we'll talk about parts of Chapter 6 on Thursday, which is public opinion. To read the parts of Chapter 6 outlined in the syllabus for Thursday. Remember that your paper proposal is due by midnight on Thursday. If you can't submit it for some reason, just let me know. Like if the Dropbox isn't working, let me know and I'll take a look at it for you guys. All right? That's